Chapter 46. Klemper. It had been a very short skirmish, and already it seemed to be over. Less than a full minute had passed since Libna had charged into the dormitory. All it took was for one of the defending harpies to lose her hand and to flee from the combat towards the perceived safety of one of the side passages, and suddenly all the defending harpies were trying to flee from the room. What was more, they all ran towards the same passage. Jenny had been facing off against 3 separate opponents when she had crippled the first, causing her to turn and flee. As the other 2 began to follow their comrade, Jenny lashed out at the nearest, striking her down. She then quickly withdrew her blade and lashed out at the other. However, the last of her opponents had moved just a little bit too quickly. Tanegi wasn't about to be denied her bloodshed. As the defenders turned to flee, she leapt on the back of the nearest, put her hands around the opponent's neck, and instead of ripping her throat out, she broke the harpy's neck. In all, there were 4 passages that led away from this cave. All the defending harpies fled towards the same passage, even if there should happen to be another passage that was closer to them. "Well," Libna said, watching the defenders flee, "my guess is that's the way we should be heading." "Yes," Mangloss agreed, "unless they're deliberately trying to lead us away from our goal." "I don't think so," Libna commented. "I think they're too panicked to do that." There was another reason for thinking they were on the right track. The passage the harpies had chosen to flee along was the only one of the 4 passages that was lit. Had Race been standing in the right place, he would have been able to see the fleeing harpies run all the way to the far end of the passage, where they suddenly ducked to the left and out of sight. Anida, sword still in hand, ran over to the end of the passage and peered along it. It looked as if she wanted to give pursuit, but wasn't certain of doing so alone. "Come on! We should follow them before they get too far ahead." "They can't go anywhere," Mangloss offered. "If they want to leave, they'll need to get past us." "You don't get it," Anita commented urgently. "If we let them get away now, they'll have time to regroup. Next time they'll be ready for us. They might even be preparing an ambush for us at this very moment." "Anita," Jenny scolded, "when they ruined my wedding there were something like 80 of them, and that was just the harpies. Those we faced here was only a small taste of what is likely to lay ahead. Now, you know as well as anyone that it's never a good idea to go charging blindly into an enemy you know next to nothing about. We need to be careful how we proceed," Mangloss offered. As the humans were chatting, Tanegi grabbed a flank of some kind of meat off the table and bit into it. Then she made her way over to one of the harpies that Mangloss had put to sleep during the skirmish. In a quick action, she raised her right leg about a foot off the ground and thrust it down hard on the neck of her sleeping victim. "No," Race said, "they're helpless." "Best time to kill them," Tanegi offered, walking over to the next sleeper. "I'm sorry, Race," Jenny commented. "I know it attacks your sense of fair play, but we can't risk these harpies waking up and attacking us from behind. I don't like it either, but I think your bodyguard has the right idea." "Can't we tie them up or something?" Race said hastily. "Did you bring any rope?" Jenny asked. "I know I didn't." Tanegi didn't seem to hear, or at least she was actively not listening. Mangloss had put 3 of the defending harpies to sleep during the battle. Tanegi wasted no time in moving from one sleeper to the next and crushing the windpipe of each in turn. It was a sort of brutality that seemed to be the bread and butter for the average harpy, and yet Race couldn't bring himself to watch. "I think that's the last one," Tanegi commented. If anything, she sounded a little too happy for Race's liking about the whole thing. Libna looked around at Race for a moment, a concerned look on her face. Then she crossed the cave until she was standing next to Anida, just outside the passage where the defending harpies had so recently fled. "We should press on." "That's what I said," Anida commented. "Press on, not charge in," Libna clarified. "We must be careful. The next room could be filled with enemies lying in wait for us." "We should have brought more people," Anida suggested. Race wasn't listening to what was being said or done in the other parts of the cave. He had wandered close to the passage from which that awful foul smell was emanating. He couldn't help pondering what could possibly be causing such a stench. "Race," Libna called to him, "this way. We need to press on. Mangloss doesn't have a lot of time left." That, too, was true. In the time since they had taken the cave, Jenny had already lost her elven features, and Anida was looking a lot more human as she too slowly reverted. Only Mangloss still held the form of a minotaur, though Race was sure that his horns were shrinking. It didn't feel like it, but they must have been down here for about an hour. At best, Mangloss only had another hour until his youth spell ran out. Nevertheless, Race felt he ought to mention what was on his mind. "There's this terrible smell. 20 or so harpies stuck together in a small cave," Jenny commented. "It's probably only their lavatory." Race hesitated. It was foul, But it wasn't the same kind of stench as the urine-soaked streets that had surrounded Harpy Town in Goldspawn. It wasn't harpy urine, it was more like rotting meat. He glanced back at the stinking passage and then stepped away. I guess you're right. Libna decided to wait no longer, and she entered the lit passage. Anita followed close behind, her sword held firmly in her hand. Jenny and Mangloss were next to enter. Tanegi waited for Race to reach the passage, so they could enter together. Mangloss's staff made a ringing sound on the stone as it struck the floor of the passage with each step he took. Libna looked around sharply. Shush! They know we're coming, Mangloss said. Yes, Libna replied, but we don't need to tell them how close we are. Mangloss nodded. He lifted his staff so that it was a couple of inches above the ground, and they continued along the passage. It was a fairly short passage. Libna wasted no time. She hurried along the passage at a relatively fast pace, yet somehow she was able to remain silent. The others, especially the three humans, were a little bit less successful in keeping the noise down. Their shoes made a kind of slapping sound with each step. Even Race and Tanegi didn't seem to be able to keep their feet as quiet as they would have liked. The passage came to an end up ahead, whereas most of the other passages down here had led in pretty much a straight line from one cavern to the next. This passage ended rather abruptly. The exit was in the left wall. Race could imagine the slaves being sent down here to make this passage. They had pressed on in a straight line, only to bump into some kind of natural underground cavern. They would have stopped digging at this point. Who knew? Maybe this new natural cavern contained whatever it was they were looking for. Libna pressed on to the end of the passage and then peered cautiously around the edge into the cave. What do you see? Anita whispered. Shh, Libna retorted. She ducked her head back out of the way. It was too late. Someone in the cave was clearly aware of their presence. Indeed, he seemed to know who was in the passage. Jenny? It was clearly a male voice. So good to see you again. Jenny gritted her voice and groaned. Then she replied in a clear, loud voice, unable to avoid sounding bitter and resentful. I recognise that voice. Klemper. Guilty, Klemper replied. Race could hear the mage moving. He could hear the clang of Klemper's staff as he walked across the floor. I never had a chance to thank you properly for that party you threw on your wedding day. Seriously, I don't think I've ever been so entertained. He's trying to goad you, Libna warned. Really? Even though you collapsed in agony? Jenny called to him. Come, Jenny, Klemper commented. Come and join us out here. I promise you that you and your friends may leave that passage unmolested. A promise from a liar and a traitor, Jenny said. Forgive me if I don't put much stock in it. While Jenny had been keeping Klemper busy, Mangloss had inched a little closer to the mouth of the cave. Now he moved. He jumped into the opening and launched a spell into the cave. The resulting effect of the spell wasn't visible enough for Race to be able to make out what spell it was, but Race was certain that he had caught a glimpse of fire leaving his mentor's hands. Take this, Mangloss yelled, when he ducked back behind the relative cover of the passage wall. There was an explosion. There were screams and groans of the dead and dying. Did you get him? Jenny asked. Mangloss shook his head. He sounded a little shocked as he spoke. He teleported out of the way. He could have put up a shield to protect himself and his army in less than half the time, but he teleported out of the way and left those who had been standing immediately behind him wide open to the effect of my spell. What kind of a man would do such a thing? That wasn't nice, Klemper's voice echoed around the cavern and into the passage. Now, I told you all to leave that passage and come here. Suddenly, Race found himself being dragged out of the passage against his will. He wasn't the only one. Of the six of them, only Jenny seemed to be unaffected by Klemper's spell. Jenny followed, nevertheless, walking calmly out of the passage and sticking close by the others as they were pulled into the room. Now Race could see the place for himself. It was a room rather than a cave. The walls were coated in marble, and though primarily white in colour, they were covered with murals. The murals on the left side of the wall were of harpies, capturing various aspects of their life. There were images of harpies at play, harpies eating, harpies flying, and harpies hunting. The murals on the right wall also had images of harpies, but they seemed to have faded away to virtually nothing and had been replaced by newer images, those of humans. Again, the murals caught everyday aspects of human life. There was even a relatively accurate image of the city of Arlis, as it had been before the elves arrived. It was a large room supported by several huge marble columns. Sometime in the past, one of those columns had broken away from its moorings and collapsed. There was no sign of the remains of the column anywhere in the room. As with the walls, the columns on the left side of the room carried intricate carvings of harpies, both male and female, whereas those on the right seemed to be a mixture of both harpy and human. There were also real harpies, lots of them. There were too many for Race to count. But if, as Jenny had suggested, there had been 80 to begin with, then there had to be at least 60 left. They stood, not in a straight line, but in a kind of arc, with the results of Mangloss's spell clearly visible in the centre. Behind the harpies stood rank after rank of elven soldiers. To add insult to injury, they were wearing the uniform and armour of the King's Palace Guard. Race judged that there were probably close to twice as many elves as there were harpies. Klemper stood in front of his small army, looking fairly unimpressed at what he had just fished out of the passage. He walked slowly towards the six, his cloak flapping as if in a soft breeze, and yet there was no wind of any kind down here. "You are held in place by my will," Klemper said as he got closer. "You cannot move unless I desire it." Ray struggled to prove the Archmage wrong, but the only part of his own body willing to obey him was his mouth. "You monster, get any closer and I'll kill you." "Oh?" Klemper replied. "But you won't. As I said, I have you totally within my power. You all stand helpless before me." Jenny laughed. "This is hardly a laughing matter," Nida commented. "Did I say something to amuse you?" Klemper asked. "Just you," Jenny said, "acting all big and powerful like the villain in a poorly written play, and yet, for all your power, you seem to have forgotten something." "Oh?" Klemper said. He closed to within 10 feet of where Race was standing. "What have I forgotten?" More than anything, Race wanted to summon his sword again and strike Klemper down, but still his limbs refused to cooperate. Jenny, though, had no such problem. She unsheathed her sword and advanced menacingly on the mage. "Did you forget, O Butcher of First Town, that your magic has no effect on me, and this time I have a sword?" "Jenny, no," Race tried to warn his sister. How could Jenny hope to fight such a powerful mage single-handedly? Klemper took a step back. His attitude seemed to change. A worried expression came over his face. He turned his attention fully on the Queen and began to back slowly away. Race felt helpless as he watched Klemper preparing a spell. The blue glow of magic seemed to engulf the wizard, and he took in as much power as he possibly could. Then he released it all at Jenny. For a few agonizing seconds, Jenny seemed to be engulfed in a deep blue glow. Whatever spell Klemper had used certainly looked impressive, and yet when the spell came to an end, Jenny was still standing there, apparently untouched. Klemper looked briefly over his shoulder and shouted to his waiting army, "Kill them! Kill them all!" Klemper's small army started to charge across the cavern toward the six. Those harpies might not be up to much in a fight, but there was still enough of them to give Race and the others a bad time. As for the elves dressed as palace guards, well, they were an as yet unknown commodity. "I can move again," Anita said. She got into the battle stance. "Jenny has broken Klemper's concentration," Libner offered. "Then get ready to defend yourselves," Mangloss ordered. He moved relatively quickly, until he could get a clear sight of their charging foes. Then he used a little bit of magic to lob small green globules into the enemy ranks. Race had no idea what spell Mangloss had used this time. He watched the way one of the green globules struck one of the charging harpies. It splashed off of her body, striking a few of those closest. Then, like acid, it ate through their bodies and either killed or crippled them. When the green globule hit the armour of an elf, it ate through their armour, rotting it slowly away. Jenny pressed Klemper hard. The Archmage tried to strike it a few times with his staff, but clearly he was no match for her swordplay. The best thing he could do was just keep ahead of the Queen and hope that his army would do something to aid him. Anita and Libner charged forward. They met Klemper's army and began to tear into them. Of the three, Anita seemed to be doing the best. Her sword seemed to sing as she sliced it through the air, and with every cut she brought down another foe. The bodies were piling up around her, and it soon became clear that her main intention was to keep the enemies away from Jenny. Tenegi glanced briefly at Race. "You should stay here, boss. Keep an eye on the mage." Then, before Race could reply, Tenegi also charged into the fray. Race looked keenly at the battle. He felt he ought to be there, but Tenegi was right. Mangloss needed someone to watch his back. Race hurried over to the mage and sword in hand, prepared to fight off any who managed to get through the tirade of spells that Mangloss was throwing into the enemy's ranks. The main body of fighting in the room was happening close to Jenny and Klemper. Klemper had managed to remain one step ahead of Jenny. He seemed to be leading her around in circles, but Jenny was getting closer with every step. Then it happened. She judged her attack perfectly. blocked the mage's staff and thrust her blade hard into Klemper's chest. Nothing happened. Jenny's blade failed to penetrate even Klemper's robes, blocked by some kind of defensive spell. "You are right," Klemper said, jumping back to avoid another blow. "I can't touch you. For some reason my master still wants you alive." "Then surrender," Jenny said, striking again. "I'll make your death quick." "I don't think so," Klemper responded. Then it became clear that he had only been playing with her. A sudden move of his offhand wrist, and the ground Jenny had been standing on upended, throwing Jenny unceremoniously to the floor. Without waiting to see what happened next, Klemper turned his attention away from the fallen queen and began to walk casually across the floor to where Mangloss and Race were standing. His robe billowed, as if caught by an unnatural wind. Race felt helpless for a moment as he lost sight of Jenny behind the massed numbers of elves and harpies who were charging him for the kill. For the briefest of moments he considered rushing over there to her rescue. He quickly realised that he would have to fight his way through half the enemy just to get there. Hoping Jenny would be alright, Race turned his attention to the approaching Klemper. He took a quick step forward and swung his sword round hard and fast. Had the blow connected, it would likely have cut Klemper in two. But before his sword struck, Race felt his limbs seize up and refused to move. Klemper pushed the sword gently away from him and then checked his neck where Race's sword had drawn a tiny drop of blood. Close, but not close enough. Once again, Race struggled against the paralysis that seemed to have taken over his body. He had to watch helplessly as Klemper gloated. "Now it's time to kill you." "You could never defeat me in a fair fight," Mangloss snarled. "Really?" Klemper commented. "You think not?" "Not a chance," Mangloss said defiantly. "And I'm supposed to drop my advantage over you? Risk everything? All for a chance to prove that I'm the better mage? I have already defeated you, old man." "You are a coward," Mangloss suggested. "Weak," Klemper replied. "Is that the best insult you can come up with?" Then he grinned. "Very well, old man. Who am I to deny a dying man his last wish? I will give you your jewel." Race tried to turn his head to see what was happening as Klemper released Mangloss's arms. Mangloss immediately began to prepare a spell. "Not here, old man," Klemper said, slapping Mangloss hard across the cheek. Then he fixed the old mage with a stare that paralysed him just as it had Race. "There are far too many distractions here. Someone might try to interfere. Best I take us somewhere else for a while." "Where then?" Mangloss asked. "Come with me," Klemper replied. "Not that I'm giving you a choice." A moment later, Race watched helplessly as both Mangloss and Klemper vanished from his very eyes. Race's first thought was that Klemper had teleported them somewhere more private. But there was a kind of backwash to the spell that Klemper had used that teleport didn't have. The moment Klemper had vanished, the mage's grip on the Race also vanished. Race felt himself able to move again. He was free to help the others in battle, but before he had time to move anywhere, he found himself dragged into the backwash of Klemper's spell.